The future of health reform. New discussions on Medicare physician reimbursement. Comparative effectiveness at a major private payer. What recent legislative and regulatory developments have the greatest potential to impact the pharmaceutical community? And what should manufacturers be doing in response? Join us to find out. In the Know starts now. Hello and welcome to In the Know, your source for insight and analysis on the issues that matter to specialty pharma. I'm your host, Gina Clark. Today, we receive the latest in our series of updates on healthcare-related activities in Washington, D.C. We'll discuss what the health reform law actually means for manufacturers, providers, and patients, as well as how recent political appointments and midterm primaries might influence pharma decision-making. Returning to In the Know is Peyton Howell, president of AmerisourceBergen Consulting Services and one of the country's foremost experts in public policy and patient access trends. Thanks for being with us today, Peyton.
Thanks for having me, Gina.
Since we last met in February to discuss health reform, the proposed bill has been signed into law. Aside from what we see reported in mainstream media, what happens now?
Whew, great question. What an adventure it's been, actually, the past few weeks. What happens next is kind of interesting because when you look at the healthcare reform legislation that did pass at the end of March, it is somewhat loaded in terms of activity towards 2014. So the big coverage expansion that we're hearing about and that people are anticipating does indeed happen, but really the full roles really move towards 2014. So in 2010, 2011, most of the changes are more subtle, and it's the beginning of the changes in the regulatory process itself. So it can feel a little bit more specific. I'll give you some examples. From the manufacturer's perspective, there are some changes that went in immediately that are fairly material. First of all, there's the Medicaid managed care rebates, which are new, and the expansion of the Medicaid rebates. Those two pieces together are one of the key funding sources for healthcare reform. And because they're effective immediately, manufacturers are going to feel those this year in terms of their own financial situation, but they won't feel the benefit of those new patients coming into insurance and coverage and benefits until 2014. So there's a bit of a squeeze there. So those two pieces are very material and significant. For 2011, we have some new industry fees that also begin to hit. So most manufacturers are beginning to look at the cost of those types of issues this year in anticipation of January 1st. And then the last piece is an expansion of the 340B program. So the 340B program has been growing in influence well before healthcare reform. But actually for next year, we do have a change in terms of expanding to include some other types of provider sites. One of the most material is the freestanding cancer center. So there'd be your large cancer centers like an MD Anderson. Now, not all of those sites qualify for 340B pricing yet. However, when they do become eligible, which is anticipated, in fact, for many this year, then that cost will also be another impact for manufacturers. So manufacturers have a lot of moving parts right now. For payers, it's a little bit of a different scenario. For payers, the big impact is much more nitty-gritty, and you've been hearing that payers aren't happy overall with healthcare reform. But in reality, they did win the big argument, which is that there's no true public option within the healthcare reform bill. But the Medicare Advantage rates have been cut for 2011. Yet it's really too late for payers to pull out of those plans at this point in time. So I happened to be with a group of our managed care experts this past weekend at MCN, Managed Care Network, and the medical directors and pharmacy directors said for 2011, what they anticipate is that they need to qualify for those quality bonuses that the government has offered as part of healthcare reform in order to make those Medicare Advantage cuts palatable for staying in Medicare Advantage. So it's going to be really important for the next few months to watch what happens with those Medicare Advantage plans. For the longer term, we may see significant changes with Medicare Advantage that could impact beneficiaries in 2012 and beyond. But that's where we're at right now. A lot of changes and a lot of detailed regulations coming out specific to some of those changes versus the big reform changes in terms of more coverage.
What about from a patient's perspective? What does the health reform law do for patient populations this year?
Yeah, the patient's perspective does depend on your current situation. If you currently have employer-provided group type insurance plan, though, the reality is you probably are not seeing any changes at all, particularly for this year. For next year, you may be impacted in a beneficial way by some of those specific changes like no lifetime maximums or being able to keep your adult children on coverage. But otherwise, really no significant changes for that group. If you're a Medicare Part D patient, though, so if you're Medicare eligible and you've already opted for that Medicare Part D pharmacy benefit, there are some changes that do go into effect for this year. They're not giant, but if you become eligible or reach that donut hole, that lapse in coverage in that benefit, there is a $250 rebate that patients will begin to receive this year. And then each year going forward, there is a closing of that donut hole. Now, copays don't go away, but the donut hole, which really created that gap where you had no benefit at all from your pharmacy benefit, that does begin to actually change and then is fully closed by 2020. So Medicare patients do begin to see some very specific changes, and I think we'll see that each year there are new changes on both the medical benefit, the Part B side, as well as that Part D benefit for beneficiaries to be aware of. Now, if you're uninsured, and you're really waiting for this coverage, most people will not become eligible for coverage until closer to 2014. But there are some patients that will benefit this year, particularly those that would fall into high-risk pool insurance plans. So families that are really in catastrophic type situations, they will get some relief, and those regulations are just coming out now as well.
In recent weeks, we've seen some interesting results in the state primary elections, including the defeat of Senator Arlen Specter in Pennsylvania and the victory of Rand Paul in Kentucky. How should the pharma industry perceive these results?
You know, it's interesting. It's certainly another movement or method where we're seeing a movement to change, and incumbents are definitely at risk in that. So it's not a new movement in that we know change has been in the air, but it certainly does echo, I think, that Clinton administration where we then came back to a mixed Congress right after those midterm elections. So it'll be very interesting to watch the race here. Certainly in the case of Arlen Specter, we've really lost someone who understood cancer care, and that is a personal concern for me because there aren't that very many members of the Senate in particular that have been as in tune to issues important to cancer care and patient access in that area. But it certainly is a statement, I think, to candidates that, and to the pharma industry as a whole, that changes in the air, and it may mean that we may see some changes to healthcare reform down the path. I don't think we're going to see gigantic changes, but we normally see in big pieces of legislation some modifications as time goes on, and that certainly is an indicator that after these elections we might see programs be tweaked in some important areas.